When Japan opened her doors to the Occident, she found herself almost in the position of a rustic, who was suddenly brought face to face with the magnificence of a royal court. If she was dazzled by the brilliance of the sight, she was also not a little bit embarrassed by the variety of novel experiences. Everything she saw was so new, so strange, that she was at a loss to how to behave in each particular case. The inquisitive spirit of the West pried into every detail of her private life, and it was often very annoying. But it was the price she had to pay for her new position. The ordeal she then went through was a severe one, but it was sultry. It opened her eyes to her own shortcomings as well as to the Western excellencies. One of the questions asked by a shrewd observer was this: have the Japanese any religion? This question set our man of learning to deep thinking and to making an inventory of the spiritual possessions of the nation. Confucianism, Buddhism, Shintoism. Yes, we have them all as religions, but are they really religions? Confucianism is an excellent code of morals, but is it a religion? Buddhism, with its nirvana, is too nihilistic to be a religion for practical life. And Shintoism, well, Shintoism is a conglomeration of myths and legends and hero worship. Are myths and legends and hero worship religion? Thus, reflecting, our scholars came to the conclusion that there was no religion in Japan in the sense of which religion is understood in the West. This conclusion was a shock even to the educated class, for it was anything of which they felt sure, it was the existence of religion in the country. But now they were told that what they had heroed to believe to be religion was no religion at all. The West has been for the last 3 centuries in a state of religious fermentation, and all the great questions of God, of man, of sin, of death, of this world and of the next have been discussed and rediscussed by scholars, by theologians, by scientists, by philosophers, so that religions and religious beliefs have come to be settled into a system, each detail of which fits into its own place, making a harmonious whole. Such a system the West calls religion. Judged by this standard, neither Confucianism, nor Buddhism, nor Shintoism is religion. It is in this sense that it has been said that there is no religion in Japan. That's an excerpt from Nitobe, Inazo. He wrote this great book, very popular book, called Bushido, The Spirit of Japan, many years ago, at the beginning of the 20th century, when he was posed that question himself: is there a religion in Japan? So Nitobe, he's Japanese, and he came to America, midway through his life, kind of early through his life, and studied abroad, went to university there, became very proficient in English, and became a great scholar, and translated a lot of works of Japanese works over into English, and did things of that nature. He wrote this book out of that source of that question, to answer that question. Being a philosophically inclined person himself, he sort of pondered on it and thought, you're right, Japan doesn't necessarily have a religion per se. Then what is it that stands as the moral and philosophical and ethical backbone of my home country? And this led him to do, introspective, thoughts, as well as look back onto his own home country and think, what is it that actually stands as that cornerstone for my countrymen and for myself and for the nation as a whole? And he came to the conclusion that as young children, they often taught the code to practice and the moral and ethical standards of which to guide themselves based on this Bushido methodology. And Bushido is a methodology from feudal Japan. It's an era in Japan where samurai and different lords and emperors ruled throughout Japan. And there were different types of classes of people throughout Japan, and the samurai were a specific type of warrior class. that adhere to Bushido. Of course, there's exceptions to this rule. Like there are many different types of people in the world, but the general consensus is this is something that most people adhere to. And so, with that being sort of figured out, he went on to sort of describe these moral and ethical understandings of how they, as Japanese people, perceive these typical thought processes. So, things like courage, things like, politeness or courtesy, and other various things like that. And it's an interesting read. It's a short book. It's only about 70, 80 pages long. It's like you can read it in an hour, tops. Highly recommend it because Nitobe is a great writer. He's very proficient in English and really masterful in the words of which he selects and chooses to describe, and really good at laying out his thought process, which is why this book has been, millions upon millions of copies worldwide and is still in print today. So I thought I'd share some points with you. Not all of it, but some interesting points. And I've broken it up into just these little excerpts from specific chapters of which he has throughout the book that I thought would just be interesting talking points for us today. So one of his chapters is called Courage, the spirit of daring and bearing. And I thought, no, I'll read the excerpt first, and then I'll talk about my thoughts about it. I think I'll go that way. So he goes on to define courage. Courage was scarcely deemed worthy to be counted among virtues, unless it was exercised in the cause of righteousness. In the Analectics, Confucius defines courage by explaining, as is often his wont, what its negative is. Perceiving what is right, he says, and doing not argues lack of courage. But this epigram into a positive statement, and it runs, courage is doing what is right. To run all kinds of hazards, to rush into the jaws of death, these are too often identified with valor. And in the profession of arms, such is rashness of conduct, what Shakespeare calls valor misbeget, is unjustly applauded, but not so in the precepts of knighthood. Death for a cause unworthy of dying for was called a dog's death. To rush into the thick of battle and to be slain in it, says a prince of Mito, is easy enough, and the merest churl is equal to the task. But, he continues, it is true courage to live when it is right to live, and to die only when it is right to die. And yet the prince had not even heard of the name of Plato, who defines courage as the knowledge of things that a man should fear and that he should not fear. A distinction of which is made in the West between moral and physical courage has long been recognized among us. What samurai youth has not heard of great valor and the valor of a villain? So I highlight that as we live in an age where most people are paralyzed by the thoughts of fear, of uncertainty, of the principle that courage sort of outlines, that is, doing what you know to be right. And I think that explains courage to be an excellent example of what it is. And to highlight what the prince said again, because I think it's worth talking about, it's true courage to live when it is right to live, and to die only when it is right to die. It is easy enough, and the merest churl is equal to the task, when he's talking about rushing into the fray. Too often or not do we understand courage in its easiest form, to throw somebody's self into the fray, to throw yourself into the fire. More often than not, the more courageous action is to stand as a bulwark against the tide, to be a shield against the oncoming wave. More often than not, it requires a lot more courage to live than it does to die. For it's easy. It's an easy action. requires one step. Take your life. That's it. But to live requires many steps. Takes many, many avenues and pathways and trials and tribulations and struggles and accomplishments in order to be, more often than not, speaking. And that's where I think starting there in the definition of courage, and to understand that to die for a cause not worth dying for is to be understood as a dog's death. Now, of course, how do you define what's worth dying for, right? But then they go on and they talk about it's easier to die than it is to live, right? And I think too often than not, we're all so ready to die and to fall on our sword. We're so ready to throw ourselves into the combat or start an argument with somebody, whether it be online in comments or whether it be with somebody in front of us or across from us. We forget that we're not enemies. And we forget that it's not courageous to just throw yourself into the thick of it and start fighting whoever it is that might be there. It's more courageous to live and adhere to your morals and to adhere to your teachings of which you're so easily going to throw yourself upon. It's more courageous to stand up with your back straight. It's more courageous to live because it takes a lot of strength. Politeness. Courtesy and the urbanity of manners have been noticed by every foreign tourist as a marked Japanese trait. Politeness is a poor virtue if it is actuated only by fear of offending good taste, whereas it should be outward. It should be outward manifestation of a sympathetic regard for the feelings of others. It also applies a due regard for the fitness of things. Therefore, due respect to social positions. For those latter express no politocratic distinctions, but were originally distinctions for actual merit. In its highest form, politeness almost approaches love. We may reverently say politeness suffereth long, and is kind, eveneth not, venneth not itself, not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh so not her own, it is not easily provoked, taketh not account of evil. Is it any wonder that the Professor Dean is speaking of the 6 elements of humanity, accords to politeness an exalted position, inasmuch as it is the ripest fruit of social intercourse. While thus extolling politeness, far be it from me to put it in the front rank of virtues. If we analyze it, we shall find it correlated with other virtues of higher order. For what virtue stands alone? While, or rather because, it was exalted as a peculiar to the profession of arms, and as such esteemed in degree higher than its deserts, there come into existence its counterfeits. Confucius himself has repeatedly taught that the external appearances are as nothing compared with the inward feelings, that the inner thought of sincerity is of far greater importance than the outward expression of politeness. With the unspoken thought, he says, the work is not accomplished, but without the outward expression of politeness, the inner thought will not be carried into execution. He thus sets the seal of approval upon the logic of ancestors who paid an almost superstitious respect to the politeness when they ascribed it to the inmost feelings of the heart. Politeness is a virtue which has been so closely interwoven with the heart fibers of the race, and is so long inculcated as a duty, that it has come to be a spontaneous product of the Japanese heart. It is heartfelt quality of it that makes it so beautiful and so worthy of its name. It is not a thin veneer, but a solid mahogany throughout. The change of hypocrisy, which some travelers have hastily made against us cannot be entirely groundless. The charge of hypocrisy, which some travelers have hastily made against us, cannot be entirely groundless when I consider the amount of polite expressions which pass current in common intercourse and which sometimes stand for nothing. But it must be remembered that there is a wide difference between being hypocritical and being conventional. If there is any hypocrisy in the matter, it is the harmless social sort which helps to smooth the wheels of life. So often not, I feel that, especially nowadays, that we are so quick to an unpoliteness, an uncourteous mannerism towards one another. And I think a lot of that is due to the anonymity that many people innately get when being online. And a lot of that's translated too much into day-to-day life, into day-to-day actions. So much so that it seems as if that nobody wants to exercise any form of politeness against another person. So much so that it would be seen as going out of your way for somebody. And I highlight that excerpt because within it, talking about that politeness of the heart, that it coming from a genuine place, of it not just being simply a matter of social construct, but it becoming genuine, is what's critical about it. Now, I bring that up because in a world of which we are so, guarded by anonymity online, thus a lot of us tend to be a bit more vile than, say, if somebody was standing in front of you, that politeness has become not the normal. And so to act polite is innately going to come from the heart, for a sense, because you're doing it not out of a societal norm such as he describes inside the book, that Japanese people do so as a societal norm. You're doing it out of the goodness of your own heart, and because you're consciously and actively doing it. And I highlight the politeness and the courtesy as something that is very much lacking in our day-to-day lives, and it's something that is very much lacking in our societal norm. But it's a good thing, because it gives you the opportunity to be genuine in your politeness. As nobody around you is doing such, you stand out when you do so. And so it gives you that opportunity to practice that and to make it genuine, because it has to be genuine, because the norm is the opposite. And it's funny to think that this complete disregard for another person, so much so that a smile and a wave has become strange. Feels weird. Feels strange to me that it's become that way. And you see the crossover between online, offline, and way people interact with others in the day-to-day world. I don't think there's anything particularly good or bad about it, per se. I don't think that everybody should start being polite to one another, but it would help. Especially with the idea that more and more people nowadays, especially younger generations, it seems, and I don't discredit myself, I'm Generation Z myself, that we suffer from this just narcissistic, what would you say, main character syndrome. Thinking that everybody is an extra in the life, in the movie of my life, when in fact we're not. When in fact other people around you are going through life the same as you. Now, narratively speaking, probably not the same, but in terms of dance, in terms of the jazz that is life, very much the same. They too are alive here right now. And to understand that and to recognize that, I think, is an importance of which we're missing in day-to-day life. That's why I highlight that. It's interesting. Food for thought. Back to the book. This is an excerpt highlighting truthfulness. Without veracity and sincerity, politeness is a farce and a show. Propriety carried beyond the right bounds, says Mamusame, becomes a lie. An ancient poet has outdone Polonius in the advice he gives. To thyself be faithful, if in thy heart thou strayest not from truth, without prayer of thine the gods will keep thee whole. The hypotheses of sincerity, to which Confucius gives expression in the doctrine of the mean, attributes it to the transcendental powers, almost identifying them with the divine. Sincerity is in the end and the beginning of all things. Without sincerity, there would be nothing. He then dwells with eloquence or on this far-reaching and long-enduring nature. It is power to produce changes without movement, and by its mere presence of accomplish its purposes without effort. From the Chinese ideogram of sincerity, which is a combination of the word and perfect, one is tempted to draw parallels between it and the Neoplatonic doctrine of logos, to which height does the sage soar in his unwanted mystic flight, line an unequivocation which deemed equally cowardly. The Bushi held that his high social position demand a loftier standard of veracity than that of the tradesman and peasant. Bushido Ichigon, the world of samurai, or an exact German equivalent, Ritterwort, was a sufficient guarantee of the truthfulness of an assertion. His word carried such weight with it that the promises were generally made and fulfilled. So, your word is your bond. It's essentially what all those words were saying. The sincerity of someone's words, in the end, is an enduring nature. And I loved how he described it, how he said, its power to produce changes without movement, and by its mere presence to accomplish its purpose without effort. And then he goes through to explain the Chinese word that identifies with the Western word sincerity. It's made up of two parts, one word and perfect. So sincerity in Chinese literally translates as word perfect. And then he goes on to describe how the Bushido practice of a knight, of a samurai, where his word is his bond, actually means something. And I think that's really relevant in an age of which we, there's ripe misinformation and deceitfulness, and truthfulness cannot be more paramount in the world than it is right now. As is literally described, word perfect, and by its mere presence, it makes things right. To speak the truth, to have your word mean something, to be a word bonded to that. Too often than not, I feel as though the words that we speak and the thoughts that we give and the things that we write come with a sense of weightlessness about them, now that you can tweet as much as you like. You can say and comment and video and put up and post as much as you think and you say, and it becomes a noise. It becomes this content. But content for what? Content of what? Content for what? What is this content about? It's this emptiness. Now, I make these videos and I podcasts with the idea in mind that someday perhaps my children will take interest in what I had to teach them, and I could just point them to these videos. But to understand that truth and your word meaning something go hand in hand. That truthfulness in the very nature becomes the strength of your word, and your word then becomes a bond of which you can stand upon. Where we're at right now, nobody tells the truth. Everybody lies. Everybody makes up stories. Everybody, embellishes. Everybody changes things. And the way of which we perceive ourselves online, especially social, we construct this false identity of ourselves and this false narrative about ourselves and the life of which we live so easily, because it's so easy to do. And that's never changed, even before the internet, right? Lying has always been the easiest path. Being truthful has always been the hardest. Now, I hope you've seen a theme throughout the book so far, that the idea of the path harder to traverse is seen as one virtuous, something to uphold, something to be a standard, something to live by. And that's what Nitobe describes throughout the Bushido book, is that the harder path is something that requires strict discipline to adhere to. Because sometimes when we give our word, when we speak the truth, it's uncomfortable. Sometimes we wish we could lie. Sometimes we wish we could go back on our word. Because to promise something, to have our word be a bond, means it needs to be fulfilled. And for truthfulness to be fulfilled in the world, it needs to be backed up. It needs to be the truth. When you say something, you need to mean it. And I think that ties back into perfectly understanding that your words of which you speak are spells. It's why we call it spelling. And ever since I learned that many, many, many years ago, that the word spelling and the idea of spells and the construct of spells in terms of a magical sense are one and the same. To cast a spell is to cast a particular unique word associated with that spell. To give that spell power, you need to know the proper and right name for it. You need to know the spelling of that word. You need to know the truthfulness of that word. And for whatever reason, we've come to a point where our words don't mean anything. They mean nothing, because they've just become this noise, this content online to just put up for exchange of sometimes education, yes, but more often than not, just a mindless escape. Into what? This fictitious life, this untruthful life, this untruthful living. And that's where it takes us when we're not truthful, when we're not speaking truth. When our words don't mean anything, we live a fictitious life and we indulge in fictitious pleasures. So scrolling social media, watching videos online that kind of realize, why am I even watching this? Why am I even scrolling this? It's interesting. It's interesting. Back to the book. This is on self-control. The discipline of fortitude, on the one hand, in calculating endurance without a groan, and the teaching of politeness on the other, requiring us not to mar the pleasure or serenity of another by the expression of our own sorrow or pain, combine to engender a stoical turn of mind, and eventually to confirm in it into a national trait of apparent stoicism. I say apparent stoicism because I do not believe that true stoicism can ever become the characteristic of a whole nation. And also because some of our national manners and customs may seem to a foreign observer hard-hearted. Yet we are really as susceptible to a tender emotion as any race under the sky. I am inclined to think that in one sense we have a feel more than others, Yes, doubly more since the very attempt to restrain natural promptings entails suffering. Imagine boys and girls, too, brought up not to resort to the shedding of a tear or the uttering of a groan for the relief of their feelings, and there is a psychological problem with whether such effort steals their nerves or makes them more sensitive. In this, it was considered unmanly for a samurai to betray his emotions on his face. He shows no sign of joy or anger, was a phrase used in describing a great character. The most natural affections were kept under control. A father could embrace his son only to the expense of his dignity. A husband would not kiss his wife, nor not in the privacy of his chamber. The first time I saw a man and wife walking hand in hand in California, I thought they were under arrest. A Japanese will not shake hands with his own children. I know of a father who spent whole nights listening to the breathing of a sick child, standing behind the door, that he might not be caught in such an act of parental weakness. I know of a mother who is in her last moments refrained from sending for her son, that he might not be disturbed in his studies. Our history and everyday life are replete with examples of heroic matrons who can well bear comparison with some of the most touching pages of Poltach. Among our peasantry, and Ian McLean would be sure to find many Margaret Howe. So, it is in the same discipline of self-restraint which is accountable for the absence of more frequent revivals of the Christian churches in Japan. When a man and woman feels his or her soul stirred, the first instinct is to quietly suppress the manifestation of it. Personally, I believe it was our very excitability and sensitiveness which made it necessary to recognize and enforce constant self-repression. But whatever may be the explanation, without taking into account long years of discipline and self-control, none can be correct. Discipline and self-control can easily go too far. It can well repress the general current of the soul. It can force pillant natures into distortions and monstrosities. It can beget bigotry, breed hypocrisy, or herbitate affections. Be it virtue, never is noble. It is its counterpart and counterfeit. We must recognize in each virtue its own positive excellence and follow its positive ideal. And the ideal of self-restraint is to keep the mind level. As our expression is, or to borrow a Greek term, attain the state of euthymia, which democracy called the highest good. So, bigger excerpt this time. And the idea with this is that we live in a world of such just unbridled self-indulgence where self-restraint and self-control can not be more valuable. And oftentimes you hear people talk about the idea of discipline and self-restraint and the idea of actively pursuing these activities throughout your life as some sort of novel idea, as if it's some sort of new thought, a new way of being. And rightly so, because it seems everywhere you look, it's just self-indulgence. It's just scroll, scroll, scroll. Hit that dopamine, hit that dopamine, hit that dopamine. Get it, get it. Just pull that slot machine. And what Nitobe is talking about in the excerpt here is going through the ideas of self-control, talking about the extremes of a mother on her deathbed not sending for her son because she doesn't want his studies to be disturbed, or a father hiding behind a screen door listening to his child's coughing, worried, wanting them to be better, but not wanting to show his weakness. This type of restraint of one's emotions, restraint of one's being is something of which the West and many modern type of proponents of the Western philosophies really push this unbridled, taking in of the world, of expression, and expression of all costs. But yes, there's two extremes. You've got the expression on the one hand of what Toby's talking about in the Japanese culture, and then you've got the unbridled, uncontained expression of the West, where now we see it played out today, 100 years later from his witness, is this just mindless consumption of all things pleasurable, which really leaves a sour taste in one's mouth at the end of the day. I think if we're all honest with ourselves, nobody really feels better to just scroll all day, to live mindlessly all day, to eat cake all day, to watch Netflix all day, to play games all day. You feel exhausted, you feel drained. And that's where the idea of self-discipline comes into play nowadays, with the sense that it's needed, it's required, it's forgotten in our day-to-day lives, in our day-to-day being, that we need to practice it. And I highlight that section to go through, obviously, yes, the extremes of one end of going down to repressing one's own feelings, that it doesn't mark your face, to then juxtaposing it to what we are at now, where we're at now with life and these unbridled, these unfucking believable expression for expression's sake. These two extremes, you never seem to get it right. There's self-indulgence. And there's something to be said about that. The virtue of it. And the needed, but obviously the extremes to be kept in mind. This next excerpts from the importance of honor. The sense of honor, implying a vivid consciousness of personal dignity and worth, could not fail to characterize the samurai. Born and bred to value the duties and privileges of their profession, though the word ordinarily given nowadays as the translation of honor was not used freely, yet the idea was conveyed by such terms as na, name, menko, continence, gaibon, outstanding hearing, reminding us respectively of biblical use of the name, of evolution of the term personality for the Greek mask, and of fame, a good name of one's reputation, the immoral part of oneself, what remains being bestial. Amused as a matter of course, any infringement upon integrity was felt as shame, and as the sense of shame was one of the earliest to be cherished in juvenile education. You will be laughed at, it will disgrace you. Are you not ashamed? Were the last appeal to correct behavior on the part of youthful delinquent. Life being regarded as the means whereby to serve his master, and its ideal being set upon honor, and the whole education and training of samurai were conducted accordingly. Indeed, the sense of shame seems to be the earliest traceable germ of the moral sense. When the consciousness of the ego was awakened in a child's dim soul, he recognizes his own acts as separate from those of other egos. When reflection on past acts brings the blush of avoidance of disgrace, is to my mind a bud of the sense of honor, and as a bud more often opened and matured in the genial warmth of praise or blame, the child comes to learn the right and wrong of his own deeds. So, lots of words. And again, Nitobe, he's a great writer, but he's coming from an era where he's going to use a lot of different words. What he's essentially talking about here is the idea of honor and where it stems from. And it's stemming from the idea of shaming somebody and putting someone, feeling an inert shame upon yourself as an innate social standing to keep people in line, keep people in order. And I think that's something we've all sort of forgotten, is to have a sense of honor and integrity inside ourselves and to adhere to it in all situations throughout life. Now, I'm not simply saying that you should feel ashamed of yourself, and that's often talked about, right? Is that, sorry, the the sun is blasting my eyes right now. But I'm just talking about that shame used in the sense of which it should be rightly used, in the sense that you should have honor and respect for yourself, so that to act out of accordance with that brings shame upon yourself, because you know yourself to be better, you know yourself to be more than the actions of which you are now shameful of. And for whatever reason, nowadays, with that unbridled self expression, we have forgotten what shame is, and to be shameful, and to understand that we should respect and honor ourselves more, and that is not necessarily something to be perceived by an individual, but to adhere to as a societal, as we have standards. There should be standards. The bar should be set high, and we should adhere to it. Now, why should we adhere to it? Why should it be set high? Surely we should just let go of our expressions. We should just let everything go. I should have no shame about what I do, say, speak, act, interact with others, things of that nature. And it seems to have no shame in yourself, have no shame in what you do and you act. It seems to coincide with no respect for your fellow man, no respect for somebody else, no thought for somebody else. And it comes back to this idea of the main character syndrome, of you being the most important person. And I think that's what he's getting at in this excerpt here, that the idea and the reason why Japanese people seem to live a life that they're so conscious of other people around them is that it's, yes, born in the sense that I should have shame for the actions of which are outside of the societal norms, but greater still, when it's fully blossomed, is that I should have honor and respect and dignity within myself, knowing that I am somebody worthy of honor and dignity, and that I should enact that into the world. So this is an excerpt about the influence of Bushido in society, and he's sort of covering off the ideas of which he sort of talked about here. And he uses the word knightly virtues as he associates the samurai with the knight in terms of chivalry, and Bushido being similar to chivalry. And back to the book. Thus far we have brought into view only a few of the more prominent peaks which rise above the range of knightly virtues, in themselves so much more elevated than the general level of our national life. As the sun is the rising first tips of the highest peaks with russet hue, and then gradually casts its ray on the valley below, so the ethical system which first enlightened the military order drew in course of time follows from amongst the masses. Democracy raises up the natural prince for its leader, and aristocracy infuses a princely spirit among the people. Virtues are no less contagious than the vices. There needs to be one wise man in a company, and all are wise, so rapid in the contagion, says Emerson. No social class or caste can resist the diffusive power of moral influence. really short excerpt there because I think it's just talking about initially meant for what's initially meant for the military order. So the idea of Bushido is and slowly became more and more gradually adopted by the masses, so that these virtuous theories and these virtuous things, as more and more people understood and adopted these things, it became more and more apparent throughout the country. And that's what he sort of outlined there. And I thought it was important to sort of explain that it bled out of the military class of the samurai, of the knight, of chivalry, and more the masses adopted it slowly over time. And I thought that was just important to highlight. So this excerpt sort of about the student of Bushido, what they look like. Is there any nation more loyal and patriotic? A question asked by many, and for the proud answer, there is not. We must think of the precepts of knighthood. Have you seen in your tour of Japan many young men with unkempt hair, dressed in the shabbiest garb, carrying in his hand a large cane or a book, stalking about the streets with an air of utter indifference to mundane things? He is the showy student, the most important factor in the body political of Japan. He is the more important than the most influential statesman or the richest merchant. He's more important because he is the marker and molder of public opinion. And public opinion, as Gladstone said, is the most powerful thing on earth. He is a philosopher. He is a student of Confucius, of Mercies, of Zhao of Wang Yangman, of the Japanese annotators of these Chinese philosophers. He is a student of history. He is a student of strategy and of tactics. He is a student of law and political economy. He's a student of everything that will make him a power among his fellow men. He's a poor student, for he scorns to devote his time to any money-making pursuits. He is a hard student. He studies from 14 to 18 hours a day. He's a strong student, for he is the force of character which can commend such application. He's a poor student, but he's a proud student. He's a proud student because he is descendant of the samurai. He's proud because he is a perspective maker of the history of his country. He is proud because he is entrusted with the grave responsibilities of guarding the honor of the emperor and his country. He is a poor student, but he is a loyal student. He is loyal to his emperor because his emperor is the symbol of the country. He is loyal to the country because his country is the land of the gods. He is loyal to his country because his country is the home of the samurai. He is loyal to his country because his country is the cradle of honor, of loyalty, of knightly virtues. He's a poor student, but he's a patriotic student. He's patriotic because he is loyal. He is patriotic because he is humble. He's honorable. He's patriotic because he is descendant of the samurai. Just a reminder of the importance of continuous learning, seeking knowledge, and how valuable that was seen in Japan. So much so that Nitobe sought to recognize it in the book as being above the statesman, above the richest merchant, somebody to be idealistically pursuant of that embodiment of that person, the student. And that's what I think a lot of Westerners, myself included, when you go to Japan or you experience Japanese people, the culture, and things like that, you sort of look at it and go, why is there such a heavy emphasis on studies and on studentship, on this intellectual academia pursuits? What is that? Why is that? And you can see right there in this understanding that this pursuit of knowledge and pursuit of higher attainers, that the student is somebody that is proud of his country, of his philosophies, of his way of life. I thought that was important to bring up because I think patriotism and how it's influenced by Bushido and how we see that played out today as a typical characteristic of a Japanese person, of Japanese life. So much so that I think we see the darker sides. We see the terrible sides of these things and these pursuits, that these weights are placed upon young people in Japan that obviously, so I'm not Japanese myself, cannot speak to, but as an outsider looking in, you often see, suicides and young people taking their own lives. I think to understand that outside looking in, you have to understand the gravity and the level of which they value the student inside the Japanese culture. And I think that's important to highlight in his writings here that Nitobe wrote about. So I thought it was important to put that in there. Look, this is a little excerpt on the end of Bushido, how that sort of came about in general, sort of discussion about when that sort of finished. Pretty much died out in 1870, signified the sort of end of Bushido and feudal Japan. So getting into that here. When the condition of society are so charged that they have become not only adverse but hostile to Bushido, it is time for it to prepare for an honorable burial. It is just as difficult to point out when chivalry dies as to determine the exact time of its inception. Dr. Miller says that chivalry was formally abolished in the year 1559, when Henry II of France was slain in the tournament. With us, the edict formally abolished feudalism in 1870 was the signal to toll the knell of Bushido. The edict, issued 5 years later, prohibiting the wearing of swords, rang out the old. The unbought grace of life and the cheap defense of nations, the nurse of many sentiment and heroic enterprise. It rang in the new age sophisters, economists, and calculators. It has been said that Japan won her late war with China by means of Murata guns and Crump cannons. It's been said that the victory is the work of modern school system, but these are less than half-truths. Does ever a piano, be it of the choicest make, play itself? The soul of the artist must be there to awaken its harmonies. The soul of Bushido, not dead, but sleepeth, its body feudalism laid in the grave, is decaying, but its spirit walks abroad and inspires the descendants of the samurai. The military organization of the country is the most legitimate heir, and in the Bushido is taught as of old, not as a cult of barbarism, but as a school of civilized virtues. And as long as Japan remains a nation, it will throb as its heart beat. The West has burst upon us with its powerful artillery, with its printing press, with its steam engines and its sciences, with its literatures, with its political and social and religious institutions. We have caught up, many of them, and are assimilating them to our national constitution as fast as we can. But Bushido, the way of the warrior, the Confucianism, the way of the gentleman, these are our heart and backbone. These we cannot give up. Nay, we will uphold them, for it is so doing we are conserving the best traditions of mankind. So, yeah. And for you that don't know, feudalism was a system where kings and powerful nobles gave land to less powerful people, called vassals, in exchange for loyalty and military services, with peasants working the land at the bottom. The system was common in medieval Europe and other places like Japan. That's just a quick definition I quickly sort of put together there. Give you an understanding there. So I highlight that excerpt because I think it's important to understand that Nitobe is exemplifying that it's not simply because of the Western learnings that have been introduced into Japan, why Japan is thriving at this time, but because of the traditions and the spiritual teachings of Bushido and other things like it that Japanese have simply adhered to inside their heart, that any other techniques or instruments that come into their possession, they're able to wield so greatly because they are a great player. They have a great understanding and backbone within them and cornerstone of their nation that no matter the Western influences that come in, they adopt and assimilate them, yes, but they are still retaining their Japanese-like culture regardless of these new things that come into being. To close out here. The wholesome, unsophisticated nature of our forefathers derived its nutriment from the soil. The Japanese have been and are preeminently a race of agriculturists. The samurai derived his income from land spent in the city. The best thoughts of our best men were conceived in the country. The country was the birthplace of the Japanese spirit, as it was of the Greek and the Roman. The greatest thoughts of our humanity, the most lasting books, have been conceived and written in the country. The city may be the symbol of civilization, but it is the country that nurse of manhood. The heart of Japan beats with the pulse of the country. The recent war has proved that to the world that Japan can fight on land as well as on sea, and she has thus proved false the oft-repeated assertion that the Japanese are not a military nation. The Japanese are a fighting race, and herein lies their strength and their weakness. The present generation of generations of fighters. The next generation will be a generation of thinkers. The generation after that will be a generation of artists. The Japanese are a fighting race, and they will fight their way to a position among the foremost nations of the world. They will think their way to a position among the most enlightened nations of the world. They will paint, they will carve, they will write their way to position among the most artistic nations of the world. Japanese are a fighting race, and they are fighting the battle of civilization. They are a thinking race, and they are thinking the thoughts of the world. They are artistic race, and they are painting the pictures, they are carving the statues, they are writing the books of the world. Say hello. Well, I need to record an outro for this, but overall, it's an interesting and really enlightening book, not only into the insights of Japanese people and their way of life, the philosophies of which he's talking about throughout the book, fantastic. But I think a lot of the teachings inside of it just really echo through to now as being so relevant. As your word meaning something, as holding honor for yourself, self-respect for yourself, and just not indulging into these mindless pleasures of day-to-day life, but having some restraint. I think these things were very prevalent, very needed. Well, I'm going to go hang out with Aura now, so thank you so much for listening. Appreciate it. Indeed. Say bye, everyone. Bye, everybody.